that we as humans has ever encountered, and that is that of climate change, global warming, with this side event co-hosted by Denmark with Greenland, together with IPCC, the International Work Group on Indigenous Affairs, whom many of you, I trust, know well. This side event is organized in conjunction with the 20th session of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and we have the title, which is called Custodians of a Healthy Planet. And by the way, my name, for those of you who do not know me, my name is Tove Sundal-Gant. I am a member of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples and its rapporteur. And in my day job, I am actually an official of the Greenland government. But before further ado, I would like to pass a word to Ambassador Martin Bille, Martin Bille Hermann, who is ambassador and permanent representative of Denmark to the United Nations in New York, a post that he took up on the 1st of January 2019. Mr. Ambassador Martin Bille Hermann has also served as the State Secretary for Development Policy in the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This position is sometimes referred to as the head of Danida. Danida, as you know, is a brand name for Danish Development Corporation. Prior to his appointment, the ambassador served also as an ambassador to Indonesia and was also accredited to East Timor and Papua New Guinea, countries also where there are many indigenous peoples living. Before his appointment as ambassador to the mission in New York, he held several positions in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, including as head of department for the Asia and Pacific region. And before joining the Danish Foreign Service, he worked for UNDP in Bhutan. And then, I don't know how important it is in this context, or maybe it's a bit important. He's actually an economist by profession and holds a master's degree in development management from the London School of Economics. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Thanks, Tove. I mean, that was very, very elaborate. It reminds me that I have to trim down my CV to only the things that are actually really personally important for what we're about to be discussing. No, thank you so much, Tove, not only for moderating our event here today, but actually also I want to take this opportunity to thank you, Tove, on the important role that you hold currently as the Kingdom of Denmark's permanent forum member. I mean, you were born and raised in Greenland. You have an impressive background and achievements actually working for indigenous people's rights for over 3 decades. And you are bringing important knowledge and perspectives to this forum. So thank you not only on behalf of the Kingdom of Denmark, but I'm sure actually on behalf of the many indigenous peoples around the world that benefit from your wisdom, from your insight, and from your experience. Now, on behalf of Denmark, together with Greenland and our co-sponsor IPCC, I'm very, very pleased to welcome you all to this important conversation. I also want to take the opportunity to thank our panelists for gifting us with the most valuable resource of all, their time. And thank you for joining us today to provide your knowledge and insights to the conversation. Today we are especially happy to have indigenous representatives from the African, Asian, and Arctic region with us here to provide us diverse and cross-regional perspectives. You know, as our planet is warming, indigenous peoples are often at the forefront of the impacts of climate change. Indigenous people live in geographical regions that are the most vulnerable to climate change, including the polar regions, tropical forests, high mountains, and arid lands. Indigenous peoples also tend to depend on on natural resources that are most at risk to climate variability and extremes. And the reality, of course, is that this forces and the events over the last many decades forces many indigenous communities to relocate. And these challenges are only exacerbated by the fact that indigenous peoples, their rights and their institutions often lack recognition, which bars them from participating in decision-making. And so while being disproportionately impacted by climate change, this is doubly sad, because indigenous peoples are also custodians of most of our remaining biodiversity, including some of the world's most important carbon sinks. Indigenous peoples have for thousands of years protected forests, rivers, seas, oceans, ice, wetlands, deserts, prairies, savannas, hills, and mountains. They have observed climatic changes and have developed effective solutions and practices for biodiversity conservation and climate change adaptation and mitigation. These indigenous knowledge systems have been passed down through generations, allowing for continued sustainable management of their resources and ecosystems. And I think it goes without saying that indigenous peoples have a lot to teach the rest of us. It is time that we start hearing. It's time that we start listening. It's also clear that in recent years, we have begun to see acknowledgement of the importance of the indigenous people's knowledge and contributions to climate action, including their crucial role and how their knowledge systems actually contribute to the implementation of the Paris Agreement objective. I think this is both positive and it's needed. We need more of it, and we need it fast. Because it's also clear that indigenous peoples themselves continue to be marginalized and discriminated against in many countries. And I think as part of the discussion today, we need to look into how the respect for indigenous people's collective rights, including land rights and participation in decision-making, is key to successful climate action. And as we look towards a sustainable and just future on the other side of the pandemic, as we look towards building back better and greener, we must also look towards the meaningful inclusion of indigenous people's nature-based solutions and practices for biodiversity conservation and climate change adaptation and mitigation policies. Because indigenous peoples are part of the solution, an indispensable part of the solution, and we need to start treating them as such. Not only because it is the right thing to do so, because it is the right thing to do so, but also because it is the smart thing to do for a healthy planet and a sustainable future. I'm looking very, very much forward to the conversation here today. So thank you very much, and Tove, back to you.
Thank you very much, Martin. What I noted the most is your word saying indigenous peoples have a lot to teach the world, and it's time that we start hearing them and seeing them and recognize their knowledge. And then I also noted that the importance that you attach to the collective rights of indigenous peoples in working for effective mitigation and adaptation to climate change. I will now turn to our distinguished panelists, and let me first, I would actually first, you can see them on the screen, but actually to honor our co-host, let me just introduce and invite Stefan Torsel as the climate advisor for the International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs, just to say a few words. Stefan, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. We are very happy to be co-hosting this event today, and with the ambassador and with the distinguished panel of speakers. This is a very important topic we're dealing with today. So, I'm looking very much forward to hear from everybody, and also for good questions later on in the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. What we would really like to see with this side event is that we have tried to get some dynamism into the side event. I think we are all very knowledgeable with the format where we invite the panelists to provide introductory statements, and then at the end of it, then we are not having any discussions at all. So I will jump right into to questions on ensuring or assuring the voice and the participation of Indigenous peoples in relevant fora, international fora, and so I will ask Achana Soreng to be the first to respond to this question. Achana Soreng belongs to the Kadia tribe in India. She's also a member of the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change. She's engaged in research and advocacy on the rights of Indigenous peoples and climate justice, and has been working on documenting, preserving, and promoting the traditional knowledge and practices of Indigenous communities. Madam Soreng, you have the floor.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to share my words here. And Johar, everyone. Talking about the participation of the Indigenous communities and in the climate action discourse, I would like to emphasize that being a young Indigenous woman, the first and the foremost thing which is very important for us young people and Indigenous communities is to protect us, because there has been numerous reports wherein peers from my young people colleagues and also the Indigenous communities across the globe have been targets of systematic racism and human rights violation. Even when we had conducted a global consultation on climate action last year as a member of UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group, so the young people and the Indigenous people shared that the human rights violation did not stop even though we were in a COVID-19 pandemic, which made them more vulnerable in this entire COVID-19 crisis, which also prevents them to participate in this entire discourse of climate action, or creating hurdles for them to contribute towards climate action, whether it is through the traditional knowledge and practices. So it is very important that we create safe and enabling spaces for young people and the Indigenous communities to participate in this entire discourse of climate action. The second thing which is very important is to recognize the rights of the Indigenous communities over the land and forest and territories, because until and unless there is recognition of their rights, they are always under the threats of land grabbing, migration, and displacement, which plays a very, very crucial role in terms of traditional knowledge and practices. Because I have experienced, and also my research says that this non-recognition also creates a barrier in the transition of this traditional knowledge and practices, because it's often non-recognition leads to land grabbing, displacement, and migration. So if we are recognizing the traditional knowledge and practices of Indigenous communities, and now we are agreeing that they need to be part of the decision-making spaces which we are advocating, it is also very important that we create enabling spaces and prerequisites for their participation. So one of the thing will be emphasizing on the rights recognition. And the third point and the end point for this question, which I would like to emphasize, that it is very, very crucial that the Indigenous leadership is part of the climate action process when we are talking about participation, because we have often seen that there is token participation of the Indigenous people and young people across. So we do not want to be showcased, or we do not want to be placed in the decision-making spaces or events or engagements of climate action, but not heard or act upon. So we want our voices to be heard. Also, we want our voices and a recommendation to be acted on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Achana. And then I will move directly over to our next panelist. And here I call on Gideon Abraham Kionge Ole Sanago, Gideon Sanago. Gideon is a Maasai from Tanzania, And he's actually born and raised on the Maasai Steppe district in northern Tanzania, and has more than 10 years of experience on working on human rights and as a defender on the rights of indigenous peoples. And he also works, for the pastoralist indigenous non-governmental organization forum, the Pingu Forum, as its climate coordinator. And Pingu is actually a very, very big umbrella organization representing 54 civil society organizations, indigenous organizations across Tanzania. So Gideon, you have the floor, and please let us know on what you see as the most pertinent issues if we are to ensure the voices of indigenous peoples in relevant fora.
Thank you so much, Tove, and I thank so much the permanent mission of Denmark to the UN and IGIA as well for organizing this important event. Indeed, we are the custodian of the healthy planet. We are the conservators of land, forest, and natural resources. And in Tanzania, for example, almost national parks and conservations established in Tanzania, where then belongs to indigenous people, communities who are the Maasai, the Berber, and Hadzabe communities. According to the questions that I received from the missions, I will talk about the challenges that indigenous people facing regarding to contributions to climate policy decisions and what should be done to address these challenges. We are facing a lot of challenges in terms of indigenous people. In this regards, indigenous people in Tanzania were not recognized as indigenous people. We are recognized and we are given a lot of names like forest-dependent communities, forest dwellers, local communities, and so many names to justify and try to make a definition of indigenous people in Tanzania. And again, Tanzania is a signatory and of adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Right of Indigenous People. But we are not recognized that as we are IPs exists in Tanzania. And given to that, Tanzania has developed a number of climate policies, strategies, programs to address climate change policies, climate change issues. But none of these policies talks about the right of indigenous people in Tanzania. Just to mention just some examples, we have the environmental policy, we have the forest policy, but none of these policies talks about or have the reference to indigenous people rights. We only have, for example, like RED strategy. The RED strategy have a very small reference on indigenous people rights, and this is because of a requirement or a kind of a compliance needed by a donor who's providing funding to their country. When it comes to a certain projects that gives money to the governments, then now the government trying to come up with some definition on how to justify that they are, recognizing indigenous people right in Tanzania. Our way of life, our livelihoods, and knowledge and practices, which are very, very important to tackle climate change issues, is seen by the decision makers as a very awkward, primitive, and always neglected by decision makers. We are only recognized, as I mentioned, when it comes to the government needs some projects. For example, the World Bank, for example, environmental and social standards. Actually, when the governments seek for, a certain projects that need money to implement certain projects, is where the government try to, seek consultations to indigenous people so that they can make compliance and get money to the World Bank or other projects that have to be created. The major issues that Indigenous people are facing, not only as climate change effects, but the kind of interventions, climate interventions, policy formulated and projects. These are the major issues that affect Indigenous people, because when these policies and projects formulated and developed, it is really actually have a significant impact to Indigenous people. For example, when you talk about the forest, for example, policy, it prohibiting the Indigenous people access for forest products, but also there is a land grabbing in the name of conservations. That when policies and projects are created, it sees Indigenous people as, you know, the destructors of environments. So it is really affecting us in one way or another. And there's a lot of evictions in the name of conservation of forest and evict Indigenous people from their ancestral land. And this really leads to loss of culture, identity, and also lead to perish for our knowledge system and practices, which is really, our knowledge is really an important aspect for us, and generally to address the climate change issues. So what should be done in this case? We really need policy inclusions to all policy formulations that have to be formulated at the national level. We need international pressure to make sure Tanzania comply to Indigenous people policy on climate change, but also we really need to continue empowering our communities to defend for their rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gideon. I will now invite Dr. Daly Sambo. Daly Sambo is the chair or the president of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, which represent Inuit, 165,000 souls or so from Chukotka in Russia, Alaska, Canada, and us in Greenland. Daly Sambo is also has a PhD in law from the University of British Columbia, and has been involved in a number of UN processes related to Indigenous peoples, including on the drafting on the UN DRIP, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And she's also currently chairing in a very important, or a member of the very important group, facilitative working group of local communities and Indigenous peoples platform under the UNFCCC, or the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, on behalf of the Arctic region. Also reflect on the barriers that were presented by Gideon and Archana, including on the non-recognition both as peoples, but also of lands and territories, and the many barriers that there is to Indigenous peoples' leadership. Could you provide us with your perspectives of the most important, the work of the facilitative working group? So over to you, Daly.
Thank you, Tove. I'm very pleased to participate this morning and thank the ambassador and government of Denmark, as well as Greenland government, and you, Tove, in particular, as well as IPCC, our longstanding allies in much of this work. In regard to the facilitative working group, and before I respond to the question, I think that both Archana and Gideon have said some really important things about the the status, rights, and role of Indigenous peoples in this entire dialogue about climate change, and really the as you said, Tove, the crisis facing all of humankind, that the reference to being recognized as distinct peoples is clearly a challenge and so important. Gideon made reference to being referred to as local communities. And in my opinion and the view of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, this is a highly problematic issue for Indigenous peoples, largely because we fought for nearly 3 decades to gain recognition of our distinct status and rights as Indigenous peoples. And Gideon's reference to not being explicitly recognized as Indigenous peoples is part of the major challenge that we face. But in order to try to respond to this particular challenge and the host of challenges that Archana and Gideon have referenced, the facilitative working group fortunately was formally organized within the UNFIII. And the facilitative working group is the first constituted body with equal representation between state party members and Indigenous peoples. And significantly, it is established under the framework of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So invoking of the UN Declaration and ensuring that Indigenous peoples have the capacity and the ability by and for themselves to self-select their representation. So in contrast to the permanent forum or the expert mechanism, Indigenous peoples are able to identify those that will represent them without any oversight from, for example, the president of the Human Rights Council, or, the ECOSOC, or the president of the General Assembly within the UN. So without any kind of oversight. And this is, I think, really important and really significant for Indigenous peoples to be able to identify, again, by and for themselves, their own representation. And of course, having the framework of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So the facilitative working group is comprised of Indigenous representatives from each of the 7 sociocultural regions of the world, as well as state party members. Here again, they sit in equity, and the objectives of the facilitative working group are to contribute knowledge, to increase capacity of Indigenous peoples, as well as to influence climate policy and climate decisions within the context of the UNFIII. So as a technical subsidiary body, the facilitative working group has developed an initial work plan to try to deliver on those 3 areas of their directives. And I want to mention that significantly, myself as the Arctic region representative, along with our Sami colleagues, Inuit, have been able to co-lead specifically on Indigenous knowledge activity 4, along with the Government of Canada as the co-lead. So myself and a representative of the Government of Canada endeavored to curate a series of 4 webinars specifically in order to raise the capacity of state party members in the area of Indigenous knowledge. And this, I believe, is quite significant because oftentimes, especially in intergovernmental organizations, the assumption is always that the Indigenous peoples need their capacity improved or enhanced. Here, in the context of Indigenous knowledge, as Indigenous peoples, as Indigenous knowledge holders, our objective was to increase the capacity of state party members in an area where we are the experts. So the series of 4 webinars looked at the contours and the content of Indigenous knowledge, and allowed for Indigenous peoples to talk about their rights to Indigenous knowledge, the utilization of Indigenous knowledge, as well as Indigenous community protocols about using Indigenous knowledge and the value of Indigenous knowledge, and specifically how to ensure that governments and others, including UN agencies and specialized agencies, engage Indigenous knowledge in an ethical and equitable fashion, which means really what Gideon and Archana were saying about recognizing and respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples to own and control and safeguard their knowledge, and the contributions that we can make through Indigenous knowledge to the entire dialogue and discussion at the local, national, and international level concerning climate change. So the facilitative working group has afforded Indigenous peoples an entrance into the larger discussion about climate change policy and decision-making in a way that really comes from the heart and soul of the Indigenous world. Now, this is not to say that there aren't any issues or problems, because clearly there are, but at a minimum, after decades and the building of the framework of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, we have a platform, a mechanism within the UNFIII to ensure that Indigenous peoples, on the basis of their rights and their status as distinct peoples, are able to make these important contributions to knowledge, capacity, and influence of climate policy and decisions. I hope that's helpful. Of course, the UNFIII's website, there's a lot of information. The facilitative working group put together a 2-year work plan, of which there are 12 different activities. So I've only spoken of one of them. So I would invite people to visit the website and have a look at all of the other activities that have taken place with this cohort of working group members. Thank you, Tove.
Thank you very much, Daly. And also congratulations with the impressive webinars where you built the capacity of parties to the UNFIIC. And you are so correct in saying that there is this tendency to always think that it is the Indigenous peoples who needs to have the capacity built, but not the member states. So your initiative and your work is very important in this regard. And then I also, it struck me, I have actually never thought that the platform is really very unique in that it is the Indigenous peoples themselves who, region by region, actually choose their own representative. So in that sense, it's actually, it's quite a new development, so to say. Now I will turn and ask Nigel Crowhall also to provide us with some of his experiences. And Nigel Crowhall, he's the chief of the section for local and Indigenous knowledge systems program at UNESCO, where he has over 20 years experience working with Indigenous peoples on their respective knowledge systems of climate change and biodiversity. UNESCO Link is a contributor to the working facilitative working group that Daly just spoke about, and its rolling work plan. So following up from our colleagues, Nigel Crowhall, could you provide us with some of your insights from your work? Thank
Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you particularly also to IVGIA and to the Permanent Mission of Denmark to New York, to the General Assembly. Thank you for the invitation. I'm following three important speakers who have spoken about their different contexts at different levels as well, from local level up through the negotiations process, up into the instruments of the UN system. So our program in UNESCO has existed for almost 20 years now, and we've worked very closely with UNFIIC in the evolution of the concept of trying to get indigenous and local knowledge into the actual instrumentation. And as everybody knows, the Paris Agreement was a big moment. It was many things that happened before that, but the Paris Agreement included indigenous peoples specifically, but also the recognition of their knowledge and the requirement of national governments to do the uptake of involving indigenous peoples as well as other groups in the processes of creating national policy and national actions. I think the indigenous leadership have spoken about the key issues about rights, the key issues about inclusivity, of effective participation around some of the architecture. But I think part of the work that UNESCO does deals with the other element, is the knowledge relationship, what we call the transdisciplinary exchanges. Most scientists were not trained to understand indigenous knowledge systems. That wasn't part of what they went to school for, and they also didn't study human rights either. So suddenly you have meteorologists who are now faced with very complex social issues, in issues that they are themselves not well aware of. And UNESCO mostly works in these developed countries or climate vulnerable countries. So we've mostly been working in the dryland regions of Africa. Pingos, which Gideon works for, is one of our partners, but also working in the Caribbean, the Pacific, and partly also in some of the Arctic areas. The challenge is, how is that relationship of working together as a team on knowledge production for adaptation, for mitigation, how does that actually play out? And I think what a lot of indigenous people have been concerned about is the idea that they are meant to be, that scientists come and extract knowledge from them and then go and do something that is meant to help national policy. And UNESCO's point of departure is that indigenous knowledge is its own unique system. It was generated in a particular place, around a particular livelihood, around generations and generations of knowledge holders. And it has its own logic, and it's very sensitive, it's very complex. It has a strong institutional framework, which is rarely recognized. Pastoralists in Africa don't wake up in the morning and make decisions about their cattle and what is going to happen next year. They have a whole system of knowledge gathering, of knowledge processing, of decision making, sometimes very sophisticated and complex. And then they have to survive. It's their livelihood, it's their future that depends on good decision making. That's quite different from scientists. And we also find that the scientists are often drawn into national agendas where, for example, in Africa, the national government will say, listen, agriculture is what matters. So let's focus on the farmers. Let's not focus on the pastoralists. But actually, if you look at the history of Africa over the last 30 years, some of the worst violent conflict has been around the vulnerability of communities caught up in climate change. So if you look particularly around the Sahel region, the Sahara, Ethiopia, northern Kenya, these are all the areas of Africa that were first caught up in climate change. So if we want peace building, if we want stable national economies, they have to be inclusive. They have to include indigenous economies. And if you look at everything our colleagues have said is absolutely important. There is the UNDRIP, there is a rights-based framework. But actually, if you dig a little deeper, indigenous knowledge is also built around specific livelihoods of hunting, fishing, gathering wild food, shifting cultivation systems, the specificities of indigenous livelihoods. That's why the knowledge is so detailed. And so our job, and what we encourage the UN and the Permanent Forum to consider, is the respectful relationship between the science community and the holders of indigenous knowledge. That indigenous people have to be the key actors in the process, that they are the ones who understand how their knowledge system works. And we try to encourage national governments to do the uptake. To do that, we have to work on multiple levels. I won't go on too long, we can have some discussion about it. But UNESCO tries to work with the UN agencies, with the UN instruments, including the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UNFIII, the World Meteorological Organization. And then we try and work with Indigenous partners to support community-led research and engagement, particularly in the national adaptation plans, but also in the construction of national platforms that deal with inclusivity, knowledge systems, and this transdisciplinary process. So Tove, I think I'll stop there, but we could share more information if it's helpful. But I think it's a complex architecture, and what we're trying to achieve is a rights-based, equitable, and effective interaction of knowledge systems to deliver a sustainable future for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel. Also for taking us into the Indigenous knowledge aspect of this entire agenda on climate change, mitigation, and adaptation, and also for linking how the disregard for conflicts around resources, land, which have been affected by also the climate change, is actually linked to some of the most serious ongoing conflicts that we see in the world, and how essential the full integration of Indigenous people's knowledge is in peace building and stable international economies. So more concretely, I'm curious to hear from you, Archana. I understand that you've been working on documentation, the preservation and promotion of Indigenous knowledge and practices of Indigenous communities. I mean, how and in which way do you see Indigenous people's knowledge contribute to improving and informing climate policy? Over to you, Archana.
Thank you for this beautiful question. And I would like to share my thoughts on these questions in two parts. The first would be like the one thing which I have experienced when I do in terms of the documentation of the traditional knowledge and practices, and which also brought me in this space of climate action, is all about being an Indigenous youth to decolonize my mind itself. Because over the years, it is we who have been told that we are savage, we are backward, and we do not know our way of living is very primitive, and we need to learn and adopt certain kind of way of living. We need to adopt a certain worldview. So this imposition is something which has always made us feel inferior of our identity, culture, and traditional knowledge and practices. So first, for me, it took me to decolonize myself and to realize that how eco-friendly and how our traditional knowledge and practices is contributing towards climate action. And this is not only for me, but also for many youth across, specifically if I talk about the Indigenous youth. And that is where it comes in, that it is because of interacting with the traditional leaders, Indigenous leaders, intergenerational learning, and also realizing our identity and accepting our roots, and also doing work as a researcher enabled me to decolonize my mind, and now being able to push forward, reading the literatures and the research all across, that how Indigenous communities were practicing and are practicing a certain kind of worldview, which is so eco-friendly and is also contributing towards the climate action. And more importantly, the relationship with which we have with nature is very intertwined. Like, it's not that we Indigenous people in our worldview, we are not mere part of nature, but we are nature is what we see. And that is why it is like also documenting our traditional knowledge and practices in terms of what it has been and what we are practicing. So this is one way wherein we are documenting our traditional knowledge and practices, also reflecting that how most of the things which we see today, like one thing I have strongly felt that when we talk about organic farming, I personally feel is this is some which I have seen in my village or practiced in my village since a long time, since my ancestors, but that was not, you know, recognized. And now people are coming with organic farming, and then there is another set of imposition wherein the cost of products of organic farming is very high. So this is one set of documentation which I feel is documenting the good practices, also seeing that how these good practices have been hijacked and how there has been imposition. The second part of when I talk about documentation is also very important to emphasize that yes, indigenous people have this traditional knowledge and practices and contributing, but also what are the situation, what are the circumstances, or what are the challenges which have caused threat to this traditional knowledge and practices. Because we cannot just keep saying, wow, indigenous people have this good traditional knowledge and practices contributing really nice to climate action, but then we continue to, you know, put them in danger. There is a threat to them, and there is their life risk, and all those, whether it is in the policy levels, like as my colleague Gideon said, that, you know, contradictory environmental policies which is affecting indigenous people, developmental projects which is affecting indigenous people, climate crisis which is affecting indigenous people. So if we do not address that part also, which is creating problems, then we will not be able to protect the traditional knowledge and practices. So I feel it has to be this both approach, which I feel personally in terms of my experience and interacting with young people, that it has to be both enabling and protecting the indigenous people and traditional knowledge. And more importantly, as I end, I have felt this, that it's always being demeaning and inferiorizing our traditional knowledge and practices. It's high time it's respected and it's acknowledged.
Thank you very much, Archana. I think you make very clear that, that with a depleted environment, then also our knowledge diminishes. And what I also noted is that you confront this this tendency to dichotomize humans and nature as if they were separate. In fact, we are also nature. We are at one with nature. So I would also very much like to hear the views of Gideon when it comes to how you use and safeguard your knowledge in your efforts for climate change, mitigation and adaptation.
Thank you so much again. To address the right of indigenous people and to safeguard the right of indigenous people to engage effectively on climate change policies in Tanzania, we as Pingos Forum have been working to ensure the inclusion, the policy inclusion of indigenous people rights in the policy level. And we are doing this through policy, engaging on policy dialogue, participations to ensure we are trying to change the mindset of the decision makers to ensure that indigenous people rights are really featured in the policy making processes. Just last year, we formed an indigenous people platform, which bring together the elders, women, and knowledge holders generally to discuss and to try to make sure that this knowledge are documented and have been brought forward to discussion at the national level. And all these are being, effort. It is an effort, an initiative to ensure that we are part and parcel of this policy formulation at the national level. The other thing that Pingos Forum is doing to address the policy gaps and challenges that Indigenous people are facing in terms of policy-related issues are to engage with the members of parliaments who are the policymakers, those who are friendly to Indigenous people, to ensure that we build their capacity in order to to understand Indigenous people issues, and when they are making policies and laws, let them have in mind that Indigenous people are the key people, key communities to their issues to be addressed in the policy making and formulations. But the other thing that we thought it is very, very important also to carry is about empowering Indigenous people to be able to participate on local and national dialogue to influence policy making and decision making processes at the national level. So all these are the initiatives that Pingos Forum is trying to to push the agenda. It is our agenda, it is our core issues that we really need to engage to ensure Indigenous people policies, formulations, laws, and strategies on climate change have to be addressed. Indigenous people issues have to be in the policies.
Thank you very much, Gideon, for underlining the crucial importance of the recognition and participation of Indigenous peoples. I would now like to hear from Daly, still, focusing a bit on Indigenous knowledge. Coming from the Arctic, of course, myself coming from the Arctic, I would say that we have a very unique knowledge. But anyway, we are basically based on a culture coming from living off the marine mammals, whaling, sealing, of hunting, and how are you able to put this knowledge that Inuit have forward and sort of bring it into the international facilitative working group of Indigenous peoples and local communities? And maybe, can you also say something about, I noticed that this facilitative working group, the title of that working group spells, both mentions local and Indigenous peoples. Can you also say a bit about that? So over to you, Daly.
Yeah. Thank you very much. First, I want to comment that Ochana said something really important. And if I had actually gone through the PowerPoint that I had prepared for this, it would have underscored what Ochana said about how Indigenous peoples are such a profound part of the natural environment, that they're a species within the environment, and all of this activity concerning climate change and the dramatic only affect the health of the environment, but obviously it affects the health of Indigenous peoples who are reliant upon the environment. But to your question about Indigenous knowledge, I just would like to take a moment very quickly to share the screen and underscore the definition that the Inuit Circumpolar Council has formulated about Indigenous knowledge, that it's a systematic way of thinking applied to phenomena across biological, physical, cultural, and spiritual systems, and includes insights based on evidence acquired through our direct and long-term experiences and extensive multi-generational observations, lessons, and skills. that it has developed over millennia and is still developing in a living process, including knowledge acquired today and in the future, and it is passed on from generation to generation. Without having a definition, it has been difficult to, let me just try to get the share screen off now. Sorry. It's been difficult to ensure that governments and others recognize exactly what Indigenous knowledge is. So am I off screen now? Or is it still shared? Okay, yeah. So having a definition has been important in order to articulate for others exactly what we're talking about when we refer to Indigenous knowledge. And here again, I think Archana is right, that oftentimes, especially even within the UNFCCC, people have thought, oh, well, we can just create a portal or a website and everybody can just dump their Indigenous knowledge and scientists and others can go and grab the knowledge and likely take it completely out of context and utilize it in a way that is disrespectful to Indigenous peoples. So I think it's really important to have those right safeguards. And as far as the facilitative working group is concerned, this is one of the areas that we've worked to underscore through activity 4 in particular, also activity 3 in terms of the materials concerning Indigenous knowledge. And all of it is aimed at creating the right safeguards that are needed to ensure that Indigenous knowledge is not exploited, or even more significantly, that Indigenous knowledge is recognized as valid and legitimate and equally, and sometimes even more important than science. And on this note, I want to say that one of the things that we have worked to do within the facilitative working group, as well as on behalf of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, is to ensure that there is recognition of and respect for Indigenous knowledge and our right to own and control the knowledge and to safeguard the knowledge. But at the same time, we recognize that Western science, that there are potential answers there, and that they are not mutually exclusive. Indigenous knowledge and Western science can work together in order to generate the best possible information that governments, policymakers, scientists can have to decide how to respond and react to climate change. So the co-production of knowledge and co-production of knowledge on the basis of the rights of Indigenous peoples is one of the events that is so important in terms of the facilitative working group and the messaging of the activity that I spoke about. So one of our efforts within the Inuit Circumpolar Council is to begin the preparation of clear protocols or guidelines about Indigenous knowledge and to instruct others about how to engage Indigenous knowledge. I wanted to point to as well, one of the other activities that we're involved in through a collaboration of various different entities is an atlas of community-based monitoring, so that our people and our knowledge holders are able to contribute to science by their firsthand observations and monitoring of the impacts of climate change. And so we have individuals in communities that are contributing to this community-based monitoring. And it's just so important because we are not only the most vulnerable, but we're the only ones out there and in these coastal communities that are the eyes and the ears and the minds capturing in real time exactly what climate change is doing in our homelands. On the issue of local communities that you mentioned, the Inuit Circumpolar Council has adopted a policy paper on this issue specifically. And basically at the heart of the policy paper is what I said earlier, that Indigenous peoples across the globe have worked for decades to secure the rights that are affirmed in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, also the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as ILO Convention number 169 on Indigenous and Tribal Peoples. We didn't do this because it was a fun and nice thing to do. We did it because of the threats that we're faced with every single day of our lives. And to have those rights affirmed in this trilogy of international human rights instruments is so critical that, I mean, it goes to the heart of everything that all the panelists have said. But in the context of this notion of local communities, largely for Indigenous peoples who are faced with this unclear and gray area about their status, rights, and roles, it's oftentimes because governments don't want to recognize the distinct status, rights, and role of Indigenous peoples within their territories, or the territories that have, the states that have grown up around Indigenous peoples. So the issue of local communities and the problematic nature of it is largely to threaten or diminish or undermine the rights of Indigenous peoples. And it is, to me, it is a matter of states trying to push back all of the gains and the successes that Indigenous peoples have made within the international human rights regime of the UN. And I think every Indigenous peoples, nations, or community needs to look at this issue in a serious fashion and take into account what the potential drawbacks and disadvantages and dangers that this term can invite. And it's happening everywhere, especially where Indigenous peoples are not present and vigilant about watchdogging governments who are trying to undermine their rights. That we need to remain vigilant about the issue. I can't, you can tell it's a frustrating and angering topic, but I invite people to look at the policy that the Inuit Circumpolar Council has developed on the term local communities, and just invite others to pay attention to this, and for governments to curb their actions in undermining the rights of Indigenous peoples in this context. Sorry to be long-winded about the issue.
Thank you very much, Daly, also in clarifying this very, very important rights aspects of local communities, which actually bars the recognition of Indigenous people's status, and is a reflection of a lack of recognition. Anyway, what I really, in the definition that the Inuit Circumpolar Council gives of Indigenous knowledge, I noted that Indigenous knowledge is still developing. So it's not just a concept that is frozen in time, but something that keeps developing. And it's dynamic. It's passed on from generation to generation, and each generation, or even within a generation, more knowledge is added. Some is maybe discarded because it's no longer relevant, etc. And then I also said, noted that you said that that indigenous knowledge and what we call Western science are not mutually exclusive terms. And where therefore the most ideal situation also in the context of climate change is actually to work for the co-production of knowledge. Now I will actually, because we don't have a lot of time, maybe I would really like to involve our audience, if that's okay with you, to see if we maybe could take some questions from our audience. Do we have anyone out in the audience who would like to pose a question to our distinguished panelists? And please make it short. I mean, I'm not welcoming long discourses or commentaries. So a question from the audience, if we have any raised hands. I have a question. I see that David Berger from IPCC would like to pose a question. David, nice to see you, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be able to ask a question, and I'd like to thank all of the panelists for such amazing and moving interventions and statements. My question is, as we engage with Indigenous people's knowledge and with their expertise and their amazing resources, what are some of the global standards that we could look at? We have from Dr. Daly an idea from the Inuit Circumpolar Council, some definitions, but are there other definitions or other labels or other knowledge that we could access to better understand how we might interact with Indigenous people's knowledge in a more ethical way, some of those resources?
Thank you, David. So dear panelists, while you write down or think about how to respond to David, could I invite one more question from the audience? I trust that colleagues of the permanent mission in New York gives the floor to the audience. Yeah, I see someone with the name of Linggi, L-I-N-G-G-I. I don't know if that is a name of a person or an organization, but Linggi, you have the floor, please.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. My name is Linggi. Hello, everyone. My question is specifically for any of the audience who would like to give a specific answer. My question is, in the age of technological era, how does human rights law or the indigenous rights law in particular engage with the concept of consent with regard to the traditional knowledge? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. So the way I understood the question, how can Indigenous people's rights be engaged in the age of the digital age? I'm not sure I understood the question. Maybe you could repeat, rephrasing it. If any of the panelists understood the question, please nod, because then we don't have to ask Mr. Linggi to pose his question again. Okay, understood. All right, so back to you. We have two questions, one from David Berger and one from Mr. Lingi. Who would like to go first? Raise your hand. Yeah, Archana, please.
Yeah. So combining both the question in terms of ethically, like how to document and preserve the traditional knowledge, and also talking about the technology and indigenous knowledge, I think one of the core guiding principle would be to ensure that for whom is this traditional knowledge is being used. I know it's a complex thing to understand, but what I aim to say is that, is it we are taking this traditional knowledge and practices of indigenous people to solve climate crisis in a separation, or do we see it as taking indigenous people together and making them an important and integral part of climate action is something which needs to be thought and emphasized. Because when we see it as a togetherness of working towards climate action, there comes a lot of respect and equal importance, because otherwise it is like taking things from them and working for an emergency or working for climate action, which is again a wrong approach, which I feel. So I think it is very important that we take indigenous people and local communities together in this entire discourse of climate action, and that has to be the guiding principle. Also ensuring that there is intersectionality. When I say intersectionality, it has to be women, young people, and people with other from other communities. And also the second thing which I strongly feel, and it is important to understand, that how technology is not something which is separate from indigenous knowledge and practices, which I feel, because it is again very important to think that what do you call as technology, and it's again in-depth thing. But what I would like to say is there are very important techniques, there are very important solution and entrepreneur skills amongst the indigenous peoples and traditional knowledge, indigenous people and local communities. And also these are things which can be elevated or scaled at a large scale level, also ensuring them employment opportunities. So it is again important to understand and not bifurcate that, this technology and that technology. It's again a thing wherein we are all coming together for climate action, and wherein we are seeing that how indigenous people can control, and how there are other technologies which can support indigenous and traditional knowledge and practices. And wherein when we talk about prerequisite, free, prior and informed consent is very important. But at the same time, I would also like to emphasize that how often on ground free, prior and informed consent is forged. Like, you take just consent of few people, and then you say that you have taken free, prior and informed consent, which is a wrong way of doing. And for us indigenous people, it is not just mere leaders of few people who is important, but the entire community which is important. And that is where it is very important that entire community's consent is taken when we are talking about traditional knowledge and practices, when we are also talking about consent and technologies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Archana. And then over to Daly. And then, yeah, Daly, you have the floor.
Yeah, just to try to tackle both questions with a response. I think that this question about protocols and guidelines, that from an Indigenous perspective, it is understood that that rights like free, prior, and informed consent are both substantive and procedural. That, for example, free, prior, and informed consent is sourced in the right of self-determination, the collective political right of self-determination. And so the ability of Indigenous peoples to exercise and enjoy that right oftentimes they have to do so in a very aggressive assertive fashion because too often we've seen, especially in the context of for example, the discussions at the World Intellectual Property Organization, where many believe that they can just capture the knowledge of Indigenous peoples and use it for their own purposes. So the substantive understanding of the right of self-determination, the right to free, prior, and informed consent, as well as the procedural elements, the protocols, the guidelines, the procedures by which you engage Indigenous knowledge holders, as Artana says, that collectively the whole community, because Indigenous knowledge is owned by the whole community, it's a collective resource. I hate to use that term, but it is a collective resource. So the protocols and guidelines can be found, I think, in nearly every community, that they are a part of the dialogue and discussion. We've chosen to work to formalize them so that we can instruct people socialized by colonial forces to back off and recognize and respect the rights of Indigenous peoples, including the right to free, prior, and informed consent, and the safeguarding control of Indigenous knowledge. You know, Indigenous peoples are the most adaptive people on Earth, right? If you think about, in fact, I listened to a young woman, a young Inuk last week, who said, you know, our people went from igloos to the internet in a matter of 40 or 50 years. And that's a true statement, to go from living in an igloo to use of the internet. And so technology, when the right safeguards are in place, and if there is genuine respect for and recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples to their knowledge, then there is incredible opportunity in terms of technology. But thank you for the questions and also the opportunity here.
Thank you very much, Daly, and also for what you said about FPIC. It's both a substantive right and a procedural right. And there are a lot of safeguards around the world, also with some of the international agencies that have developed guidelines, protocols together with Indigenous peoples. So I would just also like to refer to our web, where Guadalupe Hernandez from Mexico, she has shared us a link with 3 examples of 3 bicultural protocols made for Indigenous peoples in Oaxaca, Mexico. And all these 3 will be integrated in a micro-regional intercultural protocol. And then I would allow one question from, I don't know if it's a man or a woman, Tipururu Titu from Kiribati. It must be the Kiribati permanent representative to the UN, or, well, anyway, Kiribati.
Thank you. Thank you much for giving me the floor. Yes, I am from Kiribati, the little dotted island spread in the huge ocean of the Pacific, just south of Hawaii and north, in between Hawaii and Tahiti, and somewhere there. Anyway, we're very, very, very much interested in the discussion here, because we believe. Now, we are very natural people, like many people who live with nature. And our survival for thousands of years, our well-being, what we are now today is made up of all this, the beauty and harmony of nature, which we embrace in every aspect of our lives. And we believe that the way forward for the world is to get back to nature, and to move back to nature. The closer we are with nature, the better the world will be. And the fact we have climate change and the many other, problems of the world nowadays is because of humans sort of moving away from the wisdom of the ages, that we must stay to, we must continue to have that symbiotic relationship with the things of nature, with living and non-living elements of nature in the sea and on the land. And so I really appreciate this. My question is how do we ensure that the United Nations and all the international bodies do recognize and respect the fact that the connection between the traditional the traditions, the people practicing traditional knowledge, traditional way of life close to nature is incorporated into the moving forward of the world, rather than just to say it's obsolete, it's old, throw it out. Let's all be modern. Let's turn everything into the cash economy. And cash economy is not for everybody. Most people like us in Kiribati, we don't depend on the cash. We depend more on the resources of nature. And we want these resources to be protected and to be enhanced and supported. And now our ways of life should also be encouraged and supported by international community, not only in Kiribati, but the whole humanity, where people are close to nature. They should be supported, their rights should be enhanced, and should encourage them to do more. The pandemic has shown that, going back to nature is the way to survive, rather than to think about global economies and all these monetary systems. These are okay, but let's not forget the wisdom of the ages, where we all came from. So that's my question. How do we ensure that these are strengthened at every levels of the UN and international organizations? Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. And I give the word to Nigel Crowhall in responding to this question from Kiribati.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for the question. First thing is also to remind people that it's the UN Decade on Ocean Science for Sustainable.
Sorry, Nigel, there is something with your microphone. Maybe it's it's tucked into your.
Can you hear? Oh, yes, also possible. Yeah. Can you hear me now? Is that a bit better?
Yes, much better. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. The fun of technology. Just to remind everybody that we're in the first year of the UN Decade for Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, which is led by the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission, which is based at UNESCO. And the IOC and the member states have agreed that indigenous knowledge has to be an integral part of the work on our understanding of oceans. That has to be operationalized as well, but the commitment is there from the UN. I think when people talk about the UN sometimes like it's a bit some other place, but the UN is fundamentally made up of all the member states. So it's critically important that the Pacific Islands and the other small island developing states speak up about the importance of indigenous knowledge, dynamic indigenous knowledge, but also Daly and others who are working with the Arctic seas and these large areas where we have to engage all types of knowledge in terms of dealing with biodiversity, ecosystems, and climate change. And at the moment, UNESCO, we're just putting together some knowledge pieces, which will be available later in the year, about the importance of ancestral voyaging knowledge. So the entire Pacific region was occupied by indigenous people using their excellent knowledge of the ocean ecosystem and navigational skills. And which is, it's nice to get the recognition, but we need policy uptake. So, and Daly's talked about a really important point about co-production, about real partnerships, real knowledge relationships. Archana's made a very clear point is we're not talking about knowledge in some other century. We're talking about an evolving dynamic knowledge system that is being passed down ancestrally, but is being adjusted right now. And there's new tools and new technology. So how do we create that cooperation within the human family that is rights-based, respectful, but is going to actually address the developmental challenges and the environmental challenges that we're living with now and the next generation inherits from us. And so we would really welcome the role of the Pacific Island states to emphasize the critical relationship between Indigenous knowledge and their national science capacity, but also to guide the UN. The Pacific has been so influential in climate negotiations, and on this Indigenous issue, we had excellent exchange with the Samoan ambassador from Brussels. We look forward to that type of leadership. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nigel. And maybe we could also, at this juncture, clarify that we are talking about Indigenous people's knowledge and not what many people often refer to as Indigenous knowledge. So Indigenous people's knowledge, and we also would very, very much like the support of the many Pacific states, small island developing states, in supporting Indigenous people's rights and participation in all international fora relevant for them. But Daly, as before we wrap up, I see that you have raised the floor, raised the hand. Would you like to also respond? Or
no, actually, I think I know we have very little time. There's so many resources that exist out there, from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders to, in fact, one of my colleagues on the facilitated working group, Clement Yo Malalap, who's written about knowledge about navigation, which Nigel has mentioned, but I think that there's quite a bit out there in terms of these various different protocols. I know that in the chat that maybe there was a misstep somewhere, but that Stefan might make a brief presentation about the panel or discussion. I'm not sure. So I'll yield, but thank you once again for the opportunity here.
thank you very much, Daly, also for reminding me of the time that is running very fast. In fact, I was planning to invite Stefan from IPCC on, and actually I will allow him to do the closing work, give the closing commentaries. So Stefan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tove, and thanks to all of you today. It has been extremely inspiring to listen to this debate here and get so many inputs. And I think, I mean, just to briefly say that IPCC, you know, this is what we want to encourage. You know, we have for more than 50 years supported Indigenous peoples to engage at both at national and international level in the recognition of their rights as peoples to self-determination and to govern govern their territories. And increasingly more and more we see how important that is in the climate change context. And so we are happy to have learned more today about the facilitative working group of the local communities Indigenous peoples platform under the UNFIIC, where we also try to facilitate the participation and engagement of Indigenous peoples through their caucus and in other multilateral fora. So I just think a lot has been said today, and there's been a lot of good takeaways, and I think I'll leave it with that. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stefan, and also thank you for the important work of IPCC of facilitating Indigenous peoples' participation in global fora and national processes, and your unwavering support for Indigenous people's rights. And also thank to all the panelists of today and everyone in the audience. And I think what we learned today is that the recognition both of Indigenous peoples, of their status as Indigenous peoples, but also of their ownership of their lands and resources are very, very much tied to their knowledge and their ability to actually develop and keep safeguarding and utilizing their knowledge, which in turn is also really very closely tied in to our healthy environments. And for us as Indigenous peoples to be able to actually contribute to all the things that we are doing in the world to stop global warming and where needed to adapt to it, but also for member states to understand that, I mean, there can be no solutions in this area without having the participation of Indigenous peoples and the integration of Indigenous people's knowledge, and that co-production for climate change is the way forward. So thank you very much for today, and see you again at some other event. And
Thank you, Tove.
Thank you so much.
yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
And stay
Yeah.
safe, huh? Wherever you are.
Thank you so much, Save.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye now.